Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Field, and I'm going to be talking about neurodevelopmental disorders. We'll be talking about intellectual disability, autism spectrum, social communication, reactive attachment, and ADHD. Even though this may seem like a short list, some of these diagnoses disorders need some time and attention. There's a lot of information about some of them, and so we're going to focus especially on autism and ADHD. You should know that many other conditions can occur during childhood and adolescence, such as depression, anxiety, trauma, conduct problems, which we'll talk about next week, and substance use. Note that we usually need to rule out other diagnoses before a neurodevelopmental diagnosis can be made. As a quick example, a shared symptom such as restlessness can occur in both anxiety in children and ADHD, restlessness. And so you'd need to rule out anxiety before you made an ADHD diagnosis. From a biopsychosocial model, what's interesting here is that there are certain aspects of this that are more pronounced than others. The biological aspect is the most pronounced. There is a very strong neurobiological basis for ADHD and autism. Most of those diagnoses persist throughout the lifespan, with the exception of ADHD, which has about a 50% recidivism rate. And the reason for why that is, we'll be exploring later. The psychological aspect is not as pronounced. It is really a pretty low impact that attitudes, beliefs, and values have on whether or not a person develops ADHD and autism. The social aspect is interesting. It's not as pronounced, but it is important to look at. Stigma is important, and the neurotypical movement in response to this. There is a lot of stigma around a child having autism, and you will often find families really struggling with that diagnosis. Increased prevalence. Autism, the rate is now 1 in 54 children. It's much, much more common than it used to be. In 1980, when the DSM-3R came out, the rate was 1 in 3,333 children. That's a huge difference in rate. In general, we think that the reason that the rate has increased so much is just because we've become a bit better at being able to diagnose it. But there are other factors too to talk about that we'll get to a little later. There are also biological sex disparities, differences, okay? Autism, the ratio is 4:1, male to female. ADHD, 2:1. And intellectual disability is 1.2 to 1.6 to 1. Now, what's interesting is that with those differences, biological sex differences, disparities, there are really biases. There are social cultural reasons for why some of those differences exist, okay? So here's an interesting study to help you understand it. In one study, 1,000 therapists, counselors, were sent case vignettes with ADHD symptoms, okay, the same symptoms, that contained the same information, except the biological sex of the child was randomly assigned, meaning half of the therapists received a case that had a male biological sex designation, and the other half had a female biological sex designation. Okay? What they found was that in the study, therapists who received the male sex designation diagnosed males at twice the rate of females, those therapists who had the female designation. Okay? Which suggests a bias, right, towards ascribing an ADHD diagnosis towards males, because the same case information was provided. There was no difference in that, apart from biological sex differences. And so one could argue that maybe even therapists and counselors are not immune to this, that that we just tend to have a preference towards thinking that male behaviors that look like ADHD, they're more likely to get the diagnosis compared to what we consider to be biological sex female behaviors. Now, there are obviously social and cultural reasons for that, all related to kind of gender norms, gender expectations. Before we dive into the diagnostic classifications, to take a leaf from the neurotypical movement, I want to talk just for a moment about the importance of just understanding that people who have developmental, neurodevelopmental challenges are still people, and they may be considered perhaps more different than disordered, if you will. So this person posted about themselves and posted, I think actually maybe their parent posted about them, if I remember right. And this is what they posted in their meme. This is Cody. He likes roller coasters and watching videos on YouTube. His favorite television show is The Price is Right, and he would live at Walt Disney World if it was possible. He loves to give hugs, and his excitement over the little things is contagious. This is a person, right, who has their own interests and has their own different kind of abilities and such that you may have, but that doesn't mean that they are so different they're disordered necessarily. What's the challenge here is that there are functional limitations to autism, no doubt about it. But I think also, the neurotypical movement is right that we have to also treat people with neurodevelopmental challenges as people, right? So let's use that frame as we explore these diagnoses. A person with intellectual disability, as you see on the bottom left, can work a functional job, right? Maybe their gifts and talents need to be directed a certain place, but I have known people with intellectual disability who've worked for places like Boeing. It's very possible. So the criteria for intellectual disability is intellectual functioning that is impaired using both clinical assessment and IQ scores. Both are important. Impaired adaptive functioning in terms of independence and personal responsibility. What we mean by that is, for example, basic hygiene, money management, those types of things are a challenge. And the onset has to occur during the developmental period. Note that adaptive functioning and IQ scores are both important to the assessment of intellectual disability. And the severity ranges from mild, moderate, severe, and profound, and it's based on functioning, adaptive functioning. I'll mention here that intellectual disability is meant to be something that persists throughout the lifespan and is not meant to remit. And so just know that this diagnosis has to be very carefully made and often does use empirical testing as well as a close assessment of functioning. Autism next. Autism, of course, used to be several different diagnoses that were combined into one. For example, Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder used to be a separate diagnosis in DSM-4, but was just combined into autism spectrum, and now we talk about high-functioning autism instead. There are two main categories of symptoms. The first is impaired relationships and communication. The person may have difficulties with reciprocal interaction, give and take, with understanding the thoughts and feelings of others, with impaired facial recognition and eye contact. By the way, understanding the thoughts and feelings of others we sometimes call metacognition. It leads to things like empathy. Reduced sharing of emotions, limited social initiation, difficulties with pragmatic use of language. Social initiations, by the way, interesting because a person may have interest in social relationships. It's just that they're not quite sure how to initiate them. They have anxiety that precludes it, and social skills deficits. They may have difficulties understanding humor and non-literal speech, such as irony. And they can have atypical speech at times, for example, monotone type speech. They can also have, very importantly, deficits in play behavior, especially symbolic and imaginative play. This is actually a major challenge in early childhood because, as I'm sure you know, play behavior is the fundamental building block to establishing relationships with peers. That's how children make friends, is through play. And so if you don't know how to play, if you will, if you can't engage in play-based games with other children, it can be quite difficult to form relationships. You also see the second major kind of group cluster of symptoms, restrictive patterns of behavior and what's known as perseverative interests. Perseverative means that a person has, maybe obsessional is too strong, but they have an interest that they are very, very fond of, and they have difficulty putting it down during conversations, during activities. Their mind is there. Now, we all do a bit of this to an extent, though the extent to which it takes over is probably different. For example, I don't know about you, but I have interests, and I might be thinking about them when I'm meant to be doing other things, such as schoolwork, right? Or, I don't know, chores or whatever. But the difference here is the person is always thinking about them. So let's say that you have a child who has a perseverative interest in something like, I don't know, Minecraft, or it could be Sesame Street. all aspects of a conversation would be directed towards Minecraft eventually. They would also, when they're doing schoolwork, be thinking about Minecraft. Maybe they'd be doodling about Minecraft, and struggle with reining in their attention. They may also, when they're having conversations with other people, like peers, that's the conversational topic they always bring up is Minecraft. So it just tends to be something that's, again, difficult for them to put down. I have also seen kind of bizarre perseverative interests. My wife actually once worked with a young man who was kind of obsessed with National Socialism, with the Nazis, for whatever reason. And that was obviously quite difficult to work with, right? Because in different social environments, that's going to be very, very inappropriate. So a person may have restricted repetitive verbalizations that need to be worked through. For example, paralanguage such as humming or squealing, or repetitive motor movements such as hand flapping. This is called stereotypy. They may have ritualized behavior and rigid adherence to routines. They may have difficulties with transitions between activities or changes to routine. Limited and repetitive food preferences, sometimes a very, very restricted palate, such as, maybe it's French fries, chicken fingers, Pop-Tarts, and that's it. They may have a very, very restricted palate. Interests that fixate on a narrow, sometimes unusual range of topics, as we've talked about. Under or overreacting to sensory stimulation. It's interesting. It could go either way. They could be under-responsive or over-responsive. And then avoiding or seeking out sensory experiences. Meaning things like, and you can see this self-injurious behavior being one of them, right? That a person may be under-responsive and so seek out self-injurious behavior. They may also have strong preference for things like swings and swinging on swings. They can also engage in aggression and non-adherence to directions, and the aggression can be quite severe. It can also be indicated by things that are sometimes outside of your control, or indicated is the wrong word, initiated. So for example, I've worked with children before who have had things like gastro pain, right? Maybe they have difficulty with defecating, and they get buildup, or maybe they have like more of a gastro problem, like Crohn's or something like that. And when they experience pain, they get quite aggressive, and you can't really do much there, because when they get dysregulated, it becomes quite difficult for them to rein in those feelings. Here's a couple of examples of a person who may kind of struggle with non-literal speech, non-literal ideas, right? Figurative ideas. He can't walk in my actual shoes. He has the feet of a toddler, right? I mean, the idea there is a metaphorical statement about walking in someone's shoes, right? And they're approaching from a literal perspective. Here's another one. There's been a mistake. You've accidentally given me the food that my food eats. Now, that is kind of funny, but at the same time, the person may make a comment that is actually offensive to other people, right? Without meaning to. Let's give an example of stereotypy.
Elephant pasta, 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 elephant pasta.
You can see that there's a stimulatory aspect to that. So how do we understand autism from a neuroscience perspective? There are actually a lot of neuroscience models for conceptualizing autism. Frontoparietal deficits, genetics, DNA copy errors, older adulthood. Let's go through all of them, spend some time on them. In terms of frontal parietal deficits, we're talking here about default mode network. Do you remember we've talked about that in the past? A person may have difficulty with regulating attention, and they may daydream, for example, and have wandering thoughts a bit much. Genetics, there are some genetic coding codes that are linked to autism. As you know, as you may know, with any mental disorder, there is no one gene. There tends to be a network or series of genes that together seem to have a greater correlation with autism or other diagnoses. DNA copy errors. The way this works is DNA gets copied when cells divide, And sometimes there are copy errors, and those copy errors create problems. Older adulthood, sperm telomere length, we'll actually talk about this in just a minute. Reductions in synaptic pruning and increases in dendritic density. It's very interesting as a finding. We'll talk about that as well in a minute. GABA imbalance is another piece. And that can create anxiety. In fact, a lot of children with autism and adults experience quite significant anxiety in social situations. They want to make friends, they want to have significant relationships, but it can be quite difficult for them to initiate and manage and sustain them. Metabolic dysfunction can occur and impaired microbiota gut-brain axis. You also see oxytocin receptor gene mutations. It's very, very interesting to talk about oxytocin. Again, we'll talk about it in just a minute. And you see there a consequence of increased social anxiety, as oxytocin receptors are often located in the amygdala. Okay, let's talk first of all those things about age. In a large study of 5.8 million children, fathers over 50 were 66% more likely to conceive a child with autism compared to fathers aged 20 to 29. Now, mothers did not have that degree of increase of risk. There was some increased risk, okay, but it wasn't as large. Researchers controlled for confounding factors, including the age of the other parent. By the way, what's also interesting with motherhood is that mothers who were less than 20 years old also had an increase in risk that was actually stronger than above the age of 50, 18% versus 15. So why does the risk increase with age, particularly with men? Okay, well, the first hypothesis is DNA copy errors. Sperm cells are copied 600 times by age 40 compared to 200 times by age 20. Okay, so there are greater chance of an error there. Okay, DNA copy errors have also been proposed in ovarian cells, though it's probably not quite to the degree of sperm cell errors. The second hypothesis is sperm telomere length. That DNA mutations occur with increasing age. Sperm telomeres increase in length with age rather than decrease, as is true of other cells. Okay, and longer sperm telomere length is also a schizophrenia risk factor. Now, what are telomeres, you may be wondering? Telomeres are made of DNA and found at the end of chromosomes. Okay, they tie up the genetic material and stop it from unraveling. When cells divide, a small amount of telomeres are lost, and eventually all telomere DNA will be lost, which is a big problem for the cell, okay, because the cell can then no longer replicate before dividing and it will die. Some cells divide frequently, such as white blood cells, and they have special enzymes, amazingly enough, that prevent their chromosome from losing telomere DNA. And this allows these cells to survive longer. Also noteworthy, cancer cells do not lose telomeres, which can lead to rapid growth in cancerous cell proliferation. Okay, so here's a telomere on the left-hand side you see highlighted, and you can see through cell division there from top to bottom. And if you look at the right-hand side, the telomere gets shortened when cells divide. Okay, so over the course of several divisions, you get a shorter telomere. And the theory is that those kind of telomere shortenings has a relationship with autism. Okay, one of the other things that's interesting is oxytocin. Now let's quickly give an overview of oxytocin since we haven't talked about it yet. You may be very familiar, you may not. Oxytocin is a bonding chemical. It facilitates close relationships, trust, intimacy, empathy. It's involved in parent-infant synchrony, attuned emotional behaviors, such as gaze, facial expression, and touch. It's also involved in physical touch, and it is actually an important antecedent to release physical touch. Being held and breastfeeding are particularly important antecedents. So that's why when a new child is born these days, skin-to-skin bonding is really promoted within hospitals, for example, in birth centers. Okay? So oxytocin, it's produced by the hypothalamus, and it projects to, that means has a directional neural pathway with the nucleus accumbens, which has to do with motivation, and also the pituitary gland, which has to do with, you know it, the sympathetic system, okay? The release of cortisol and adrenaline. Okay, interesting, right? As well, oxytocin receptors are located in the amygdala. And this is a very important piece of the puzzle. Remember, the amygdala is the seat of fear, emotional processing? It is believed that oxytocin has a calming and soothing effect in response to anxiety and fear. Okay? So it's not only a bonding chemical, it also assuages anxiety and fear. In addition, this goes back to our HPA axis, it inhibits the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, by the pituitary gland, which then downregulates the HPA axis. Now, the way to think about it is this. Imagine you have an infant who's upset or frightened. They seek caregiver comfort, especially if they have a caregiver who's trustworthy, right? Who's not going to abuse or neglect them. They'll seek comfort. That bonding, that being held, for example, is very common with young children, leads to oxytocin release, right? Because remember, bonding is this being held is a major antecedent to release. And so that assuages amygdala activation, right? And downregulates stress response. Amazing, right? And so oxytocin has a major role in how we cope with, manage our own fear as children and the relationship we have with caregivers. Now, what's interesting when we look at autism and also when we look later on at reactive attachment disorder is that there are impairments in the oxytocin system in autism and in reactive attachment. In oxytocin knockout studies, we have to talk about this first. And what is a knockout study? It's a very unpleasant thing that they do in animal experiments. I don't love animal experiments. They're important, but I'm a vegan, so I don't love it. They basically will remove all oxytocin receptors or something like, they'll alter through surgery and such, through genetic change, they'll alter the brains of mice. Okay, and so you can change the brains of mice so that all oxytocin receptors are removed and replaced with non-genetic DNA in mice. Okay, when they do that, the mice demonstrate impaired recognition of others, increased aggression, and impaired rat offspring interaction with their mothers. They don't seek bonding, right? They don't seek nurturance. Instead, they become aggressive. This somewhat helps us understand the aggression you see in autism and reactive attachment. Okay. Now, with autism, in a meta-analysis of 16 studies, there are significant changes and mutations to oxytocin receptor genes in children with autism. Okay, and as you might imagine, social impairments are noted, and they're a central symptom cluster of autism. Okay, so some people believe that oxytocin receptor dysfunction is a potential biomarker of autism. There are still other neurological correlates of autism. As I said, it's a complex disorder. There are quite a few neurobiological correlates, okay? So we have to talk about synaptic pruning next. So at the age of 2, children have the most synaptic connections they'll ever have during their lifetime. Amazing, okay? These connections facilitate rapid learning. Synapses can be formed within minutes or hours after an activity in response to activities, environmental events. It leads to very rapid, fast learning, okay? But what happens is children have more synaptic connections than they functionally need. And so at the age of about between 2 to 4, synaptic pruning occurs. Okay, you've probably heard the terrible 2s and the 3-nager phase. This, you usually know when your child is going through pruning because they're quite edgy. Pruning is experience dependent. And so what happens is when things get removed, the synapses get removed, unused synaptic connections are eliminated. So it's use it or lose it, okay? The way this happens is microglia, remember the glial cells, engulf synapses via phagocytosis. At 10 years of age, 50% of synapses have been eliminated, okay? This has implications, of course, for language development, right? That it's harder to learn a language as you get older. What also is important to note here is that the whole reason for this, that we get these synapses eliminated, it makes us more efficient, right? Because we just have the synapses that we need, that we're using. Those are the ones that are still there, and the ones that aren't being used are removed. Without that, you tend to have too much noise in the brain. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. So here is a graphic kind of depicting this. Look at the amount of neurons and synapses that a newborn has, and then at 6 months, and then at 2 years, and then at 4 years, right? There has been a pruning. So again, overpreponderance of synapses leads to overcommunication between brain structures, which creates confusion and noise within the brain. Now, in autism, it's associated with reductions in pruning and increased, therefore, density of dendritic spines, more receptors. Why does this happen? The protein mTOR is overproduced, which reduces synaptic pruning. Autism is also associated with greater numbers of degraded and old neurons and a marker of problems with glial function. Okay? We've talked about default mode network already, so I'm going to skip this here. Let's talk about vaccinations next. So we've talked a lot about the neuroscience of autism and covered a lot of pieces there. What I'm going to also say is something that is not a factor in why children with autism why children develop autism. You've probably heard about the theory that vaccinations, particularly the MMR vaccine, has been associated with autism. Well, I can tell you there is no enhanced risk found in scientific studies. Okay? In fact, the story of how that got associated with autism, the MMR, is very interesting. There was a Brit called Andrew Wakefield. He was a British doctor. He published a 98 article in The Lancet that connected MMR with autism risk with a very small sample size, 12. Okay? Note that Wakefield had financial interests. He was funded by lawyers who represented the parents who sued vaccine-producing companies. Okay? He also cherry-picked data for the study, and most curious of all, his study was based on data from really bizarre bizarre blood draws. He would do blood draws at his child's birthday parties of other children and use their data for the study. Very strange. So no, there's no evidence of the MMR vaccine being connected to autism, despite what you might read in popular culture and media. So what do we do with autism in terms of treatment planning? The first is, it's very important to mention, early intervention matters. It is crucial. There's very good evidence that the earlier the intervention, the better. You want to help the child develop social skills, language skills, and occupational therapy and physical therapy is often indicated here. You want to help daily activity scheduling, because remember, children do better with a routine and adherence to it, and so parents are probably better off with figuring that out early. You also want to initiate the gold standard for treatment, which is applied behavior analysis. Okay, that is not easy to do. As a counselor, you need to be trained in it. It's something that requires specialization, and so you're probably going to be referring to an ABA therapist. And again, the identification of this is probably not something you're going to be doing either. Usually, it's detected in something like a developmental pediatric kind of clinic. In terms of what you might do in childhood, though, with a child who has, say, autism, emotional regulation and social skills training matters, and so working on that with the child can be very helpful. Family therapy and parent education can be a major component. The family may struggle with the fact that the child has that diagnosis. We actually have a slide coming up about how to do that. And during adolescence, your focus should shift a little bit. You want to help with independence, job skills, handling money, in addition to continuing work on emotional regulation. In adulthood, the person may need help with marital or family therapy and perspective training and taking. Note that depth work and play therapy are largely unsuccessful, right? That the child needs concrete skills and the adult needs skills less than depth work. In case you're curious about what ABA looks like if you've never seen it, it's very heavily data focused. And what happens is you're basically measuring how a person is responding to interventions. And you look at baseline, and then you look at what basically is happening with the behavior with certain interventions, and hopefully be able to kind of eventually get it down to zero, to stop problem behavior, for example. This is often used for things like aggressive behavior or avoidance behavior of work tasks and such. What about family-focused intervention? How do we do this? Active listening is more effective than problem solving here. What we mean by this is, and there's good studies that support it, parents may feel like there isn't really a ready problem. A ready solution to the problem. That that, for example, they're going to be just wrestling with how to best parent a child with autism, and there's no respite really for them. So approaching it as okay, let's figure out like how to solve X, Y, and Z problem may be less helpful in the long run than just providing them with a space to talk. Positive reframing can help parents display love and affection. So talking about the positive qualities of the child because they may be quite burned out. Addressing ambiguous loss reactions, such as that your child seems to make one step forward with progress and then 2 steps backwards, and it just really rekindles your hope that eventually they'll recover from this and won't have autism anymore. And now you're struggling with these feelings once again of, I don't want my child to have autism and all that means. Okay. So accepting the child's diagnosis, getting behind them, accepting their differences, that neurotypical approach is very helpful with parents as well. You want to address family dynamic issues at times. For example, siblings can demonstrate behavioral issues and may feel left out because the parent may have to focus a lot of time on the child with autism. Consider organizing a support group. Parent-to-parent support can be very impactful. Caregiver-to-caregiver support, I should say. Assist parents or caregivers to self-advocate for services. Oftentimes, the services available to parents are not readily apparent, and the caregiver has to kind of figure that out. For example, in the school system, the school may not even inform them about their rights for example, the eligibility process. And so helping parents understand that can be very helpful. There can also be quite complicated and separate systems they have to navigate, such as occupational therapy at one clinic, PT at another clinic, ABA at another clinic, and their medical care at a different clinic. And all of a sudden they're going to 4, 5, 6 different providers. And so navigating all that and helping to some to organize and if they can, possible centralize that can be helpful. And then you may also be coordinating care with multiple other professionals, such as in-home therapists. In-home therapists, may be helping the family kind of figure out how best to cope and deal, and for example, implement things like regular family schedules, as well as positive reinforcement approaches. And knowing what the in-home therapist is doing and working with them can be very important. Okay, so that's autism. We're now going to talk about reactive attachment disorder. I conceptualize this as attachment trauma. It's marked by history of insufficient care, which are kind of like traumatic events. And I have often seen this in children who have been adopted from Eastern European countries. And what happens is that the child, if they are raised in an orphanage where there is very little contact with the adult caregiver, meaning they're left in the crib for most of the day, there's no real interaction with the child, with other children, or with the caregiver, the child does not develop a relational frame. What I mean by that is, that kind of neglect, emotional, physical neglect, can lead to the child not valuing relationships. They're just not something they've ever received, and so they don't seek them out or look for them. Okay? So the symptomatic response, a consistent pattern of inhibited, withdrawn behavior towards adult caregivers, minimally seeking or responding to comfort when distressed, persistent social and emotional disturbance that includes limited positive affect, social and emotional response to others, a limited one, and unexplained negative emotions during non-threatening interactions with caregivers. Again, to understand this, think about oxytocin as we learned about it before. Remember, oxytocin is the bonding chemical. It assuages fear, and children will seek caregiver comfort, right, when they're afraid and upset, and oxytocin is released. Well, if you don't have that history, then you may not, for example, have an adaptive oxytocin receptor system, right? You may have an impaired oxytocin system, and so you're not going to benefit from caregiver support later in a childhood. Okay. I also want to mention here about reactive attachment before we go into disinhibited social engagement. That reactive attachment problems can be really significant and probably one of the most challenging clinically that I've faced, because the child doesn't have much interest in engaging with the caregiver. Even children with autism can actually have a quite close relationship with caregivers, but children with reactive attachment really don't have much interest in that. And what that can lead to, if you're not careful, is the child seeing everyone around them as an object and being quite aggressive and not really having any particular motivation to change that. Okay? The parent may say to them, for example, "It's really upset me that you did this," and it doesn't faze the child. Okay, disinhibited social engagement. This used to be categorized as a type of reactive attachment. Now it's its own disorder. It's just, in my mind, another example of disorganized attachment. So what happens here? You need a history of insufficient care, and then the symptomatic response is actually the opposite of what you see with reactive attachment. There is low reticence in approaching and interacting with adults, overly familiar behavior. There's a diminished checking back with adult caregiver after venturing away, and a willingness to leave with strangers. So it's almost like an over familiarity and attachment to others versus a lack of interest in others altogether. The neuroscience of this is interesting and is worth kind of pointing out quickly. So this is a PET scan, and you see the difference between the two brains on the right and the left. So let's look at the left first. This is a healthy brain. This is a child who has not experienced profound neglect. Okay, now on the right-hand side, you have a child. This is a brain of a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized shortly after birth, and it shows the effect of extreme deprivation in infancy. Note that the temporal lobes, which are highlighted there, okay, have almost no activity in them, okay, are very underactive. Note that the temporal lobes regulate emotions, right, receive input from the senses, and we associate temporal lobes with the limbic area, okay? And so you tend to see a fairly low amount of emotional awareness and regulation, right, as well as problems with memory. A child who has experienced quite profound neglect during early childhood may have significant memory problems. So what do we do with attachment-based disorders? Well, prevention is complicated. If a child does have reactive attachment disorder, if they've developed it, the goal is more wellness than prevention per se. The goal is really avoiding burnout, because it's very hard to kind of interrupt and change reactive attachment once it's there. There are things that we can do, but preventing it, it may be too late unless you can literally change the way an orphanage functions. So we're looking to provide support to caregivers, foster parents, adoptive parents, right, who may be struggling with some of the child's responding. Respite services can be helpful to give the caregiver a break, and specialized parent ed, right, to help the parent understand why the child is behaving the way they're behaving. In terms of intervention and treatment, long-term attachment-based work is often indicated. It is not always successful. It can be, can fail, as you see in the last bullet. Okay, especially if the child remains attached to dysfunctional caregivers. This is complicated, but you will work with children too who were not raised in an orphanage, but they were raised with caregivers who are very, very neglectful. But they still feel a sense of attachment to them, and they cannot attach as easily to the foster parents or adoptive parents, those caregivers, because they feel a sense of affiliation still with their primary original caregivers. Behavioral approaches can also be helpful, particularly things that involve positive reinforcement, because a person may be motivated to, for example, seek out, a tangible such as iPad time and such, and work towards that through, positive reinforcement and token economy systems. And that may be more successful in some regards than expecting them to forge a relationship when they've never experienced one before. It's possible, but it's very long-term work. ADHD. So, moving to ADHD then, 2 tracks of symptoms lasting at least 6 months. Inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. What is inattention? Lack of close attention to work, careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention in lectures, conversations, and reading, avoiding tasks requiring sustained effort, not listening when spoken to directly because the mind is elsewhere, being easily distracted and often forgetful, not following through on instructions, schoolwork, chores, and duties, difficulty with organization, poor time management, failing to meet deadlines, losing objects necessary for task completion. Okay, so that's all the inattention symptoms. Hyperactivity and impulsivity. Fidget, squirming in seat, leaving seat when sitting as expected, running or climbing inappropriately, especially in classrooms, restlessness on the go as if driven by a motor. A clinical example of this is, I was once asked, I've actually been asked plenty of times by students, does a child really have ADHD if they're at the age of like 4? Like, isn't that a bit inappropriate? I have once observed a child at the age of 4 basically climb up on top of their parents' car and jump up and down on the car for hours. Just to give you an idea of, it can be very extreme like that. And in that kind of case, then yes, it does fit at that age. But most cases, you're not going to see that kind of extreme response. Unable to engage in activities quietly, talking excessively, difficulty waiting turn and blurting out the answer before a question is asked, interrupting or intruding on others. You're probably familiar with most of these symptoms. ADHD is very well known. The specifiers are mild, moderate, and severe, and note that there are 3 primary types: predominantly inattentive, that's the first cluster, predominantly hyperactive or impulsive, second cluster, and combined type. I will also add here that it's more typical for a child with inattention to get missed, if you will, and to get diagnosed much later in life versus hyperactivity and impulsivity. The reason for that is it tends to just stand out more in social settings and becomes more problematic, and there's a need for quicker intervention. Social communication disorder, next. This is social skills deficits without other features of autism. The reason I'm covering it here is that it is a frequent co-occurring condition with ADHD. It's marked by difficulties in social communication, please, thank you, etc. Changing communication to match context, for example, the difference between classroom versus playground type of tone and pitch. Following rules for conversation of storytelling, like taking turns, attunement to verbal and nonverbal signals. Making inferences for what is not explicitly stated, especially ambiguous or non-literal language. So, for example, difficulties with humor and metaphor. Okay, and so you often will find children with ADHD who also have major social skills deficits, but that's not always the case. But it certainly can be the case, and you may consider the second diagnosis if it fits. So, ADHD, how do we understand it? Right? What is going on that a person develops it? We have to first talk about the typical way in which the brain develops. Okay, this is true for all children, with and without ADHD. You'll note that in terms of volumetric and synaptic density, the limbic region and the striatum, what we associate with, for example, emotional processing, memory, that develops faster than the frontal lobe. Okay, the frontal lobe can take quite a while to mature, whereas the limbic region and striatum tends to mature by about the age of 15 to 20, whereas the frontal lobe completely matures by the age of usually about 25, okay? And has a bit more of a slowed kind of trajectory. The reason that's important is because often a child, will, especially in elementary school, may have difficulty with executive functioning, planned behavior, thinking before acting. They can be impulsive. All children can be like this, okay? In addition, during adolescence, you often will have children who usually make more emotional decisions, right, than rational, thought-out decisions, again, because the limbic region and striatum have developed faster than the frontal lobe. How does this relate to ADHD? As you'll see, it's important to consider because age does matter with ADHD, as you'll see with an important kindergarten study. Not all areas of the CNS myelinate at the same time, as I mentioned. Remember, myelination, that has to do with the development of myelin sheath around the axon that speeds up the rate of neurotransmission. Myelination tends to develop in a back-to-front direction. What that means is that sensory and motor neurons myelinate more quickly than neurons in the prefrontal areas. And so that leads to things like sensory motor cortex being largely complete by the end of the second year. A person can run by the end of the second year, whereas prefrontal cortex myelination lasts through early adulthood. That's why we say the brain hasn't fully developed now until the age of 25 or so. Okay. Now, the slow development of the prefrontal cortex means children have difficulty with frustration tolerance, choosing long-term over short-term benefits. If you've never watched the marshmallow experiment, it's worth watching on YouTube. It's very interesting to watch. Children who enter kindergarten at younger ages related to this are at greater risk of an ADHD diagnosis. There are greater rates of it. Why? Well, think about age and brain development, right? We are already lagging a bit in frontal lobe development, okay? If we enter kindergarten at a younger age, we're going to be at increased risk of ADHD because the brain is not going to have developed as quickly. So in general, it is better to wait before a child enters into kindergarten. Here's some information about remitting versus persistent ADHD. I mentioned that 50% of the time, believe it or not, ADHD remits in adulthood. The person loses that diagnosis. And the way to understand that before we dig into this specific graphic is think about what we just said about how frontal lobe development lasts until the mid-20s. You could argue that ADHD really is just captured for a lot of people as just a neurodevelopmental slowed trajectory of frontal lobe development, right? That eventually they get there, that the frontal lobe develops and they no longer have ADHD. At least that was something that I would postulate. Now, that doesn't mean that ADHD is false, that doesn't exist in adulthood. It does for some people. It's just that, we also have to understand people develop the prefrontal areas, the frontal cortex, at different speeds. Okay, so what happens in remitting versus persisting ADHD? What have they found? What's really interesting? If you look at B and C there, so B is control and then persisting ADHD. What you see is that there are differences in brain activity, less brain activity, and then where you compare that to remitting versus persisting ADHD, okay, you see, again, more brain activity in the frontal areas, okay? So in other words, what's happening with persistent ADHD is that the frontal areas don't catch up, right? And they don't have that same amount of activity. So we say that there's more positive connectivity, positive functional connectivity between the medial PFC and the posterior cingulate cortex. You know what that has to do with? That's right. It has to do with the default mode network. And so you're able to control, right, your own kind of wandering thoughts, wandering impulses with time for those who are able to remit their ADHD. What are some other neural correlates of ADHD? Again, there are quite a few. Premature birth, that is correlated to it for some children. The cortex can lack neuronal volume and synaptic density of third trimester growth. And so that delay in growth trajectory, we talked about growth trajectory already, is associated with ADHD type symptoms. So there's a slight increased rate of ADHD among children who are born prematurely. In twin studies, ADHD is highly heritable. It also has what's interesting, a heterogeneous genetic profile, meaning it's quite difficult to identify just one series of genes to identify ADHD. People with ADHD actually have very different genetic sequences that are involved with symptomology and multiple genetic markers. What researchers have identified are genes involved with dopamine and brain-derived neurotropic factor being related to ADHD, and a specific gene that I'm not going to say out loud. DNA copy variants can also play a role as with autism. Remember what copy variants? The DNA has to copy through cell division, and eventually you get copy errors. So, ADHD treatment planning, what do we do? Prevention, limiting negative social impacts. Remember that children with ADHD may have difficulty with social relationships, and that can be caused by difficulties with turn taking, etc., impulsive behavior that puts other children off. And so we want to help them to establish positive peer relationships. Finding healthy forms of sensation seeking matters. Often children with ADHD do seek sensations. Skateboarding is a good example of something that children may enjoy, things like that. Social skills training can be very helpful, talking through the give and take in a relationship, the ways to initiate relationships and sustain them. Single-player team sports are often something to consider. Not that a child with ADHD can't play team sports, but let's say that your, mind is wandering and you're playing baseball, for example, and you miss the ball out in the outfield. Your team may ostracize you for that. So there's always the risk in team sports of potentially a person getting ostracized. So single-player team sports, kickboxing, tennis, golf, badminton can be another option. In my opinion, one of the best prevention mechanisms is daily vigorous exercise in the morning because it does boost dopamine. And so that's going to be helpful with attention and concentration throughout the day if a child is able to do that before they go to school. In terms of intervention and treatment, this looks like it's going to be kind of mixed up here, but enhancing attention and reducing impulsivity through mindfulness and neurofeedback can be helpful. Note that stimulant medication is useful for moderate to severe ADHD, especially. It has a very high efficacy rate, about 80% efficacy. I'll also mention that it works a lot faster than mindfulness and neurofeedback does. And neurofeedback is FDA approved for ADHD, but it takes 30 to 40 sessions. It can take a while to take effect. Self-regulation games can be helpful to start practicing impulse control, such as Simon says, with young children. Token economy systems can be very helpful for children to feel like they're working towards something positive, right? Rather than just getting punished for forgetfulness, for example. So it helps them to build organizational skills. And in academics, I have found it very helpful to teach students to skim read and select the most salient points, to basically create their own system of hacking, if you will, reading. Because children with ADHD often struggle with reading. They still need to be reading, but they need to find a way to do it in a more efficient way. How do you assess for autism and ADHD, you might wonder? Well, to do so, it requires specialized knowledge and training. In my opinion, self-report are not the most reliable methods here, because when that happens, you're usually relying on parent and teacher report. Okay. The best method is objective assessments. For example, with ADHD, the continuous performance test, whereby a person will watch the screen and they'll try to hit the spacebar every time a certain color X appears on the screen and not hit the spacebar when a different colored X appears on the screen. It's good for testing impulse control and attention. The Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule is also the gold standard of autism assessment. There's a second edition out now, I believe. And basically have two observers watching a child perform a series of tasks. They rate the child on those tasks, and that's the way in which they make the diagnosis of autism. Both of these types of tests require significant resources, and so they're usually only available in schools if you're lucky, or more likely in specialized clinics. And so finding a clinic that has this is important. When I refer a client to get tested for something like ADHD or autism, I ask if they have these specific tests at their clinic. In conclusion, it's increasingly likely you will work frequently with children with autism and ADHD because of the prevalence rate. I didn't mention it, but the ADHD prevalence is 8% of all children. The neurotypical movement is crucial to addressing stigma, both with families and within communities, to help understand that autism is a difference, and sure there are deficits, but largely should be seen as a difference. Autism is a complex neurological condition with multiple neurological correlates, same with ADHD. Assessment should be formal and objective if possible, and the tests that I talked about are the gold standard. Early intervention is crucial to developing skills in autism, and if a person goes too long, if they start to get older, 5, 6, 7, it can be quite difficult for them to gain the skills they need to be successful. Behavioral approaches are the gold standard, particularly with both ADHD and autism. Parent education, parent support groups, and family therapy may be indicated for autism, and that's something that counselors are best prepared to provide, whereas something like ABA is something probably you're not going to be doing. Medication is highly effective for ADHD. You should just know that that's always a treatment option, though not every child or adult or parent will want it. So you have to explore other options as well. And that concludes this video lecture.